In this video, we will talk about the facial skull and bones which belongs to the facial skull. Facial skull are cranium viscerale, cranium faciale, or splenocrinium, consist of the 9 bones such as nasal, lacrimal, maxilla, zygomatic bone, or ozygomaticum, inferior nasal concha, mandible, palatine bone, and last one is hyoid bone. All of these bones also, I forget to mention the vomer. All of these bones belongs to the last one is vomer. All of these belongs to the facial cranium, viscerocranium. Yes, there is viscerocranium, anterior facial or splenic part of the skull. All these bones form the skeleton of the face, skeleton of the nasal cavity, oral cavity, relate to form the orbit together with other skull bones. Okay, first bone which we will talk about is the maxilla. In this video we will talk about the maxilla and mandible, all other small bones of the viscerocranium in other video. Maxilla, first bone of the viscerocranium. I will choose 2 and hide others. This is the parent bone, which located in the anterior aspect of the facial skull, which consists of the several parts such as body and processes and related with. This relationship with. First, relationship in this direction with zygomatic bone, with frontal bone. Yes, there is in superior part. Next one, relationship from behind. Yes, from behind together with palatine bone. Yes, small relationship with the sphenoidal bone. Yes, in this direction through the gap, and relationship in this aspect with inferior nasal concha, and here with ethmoidal bone. Understanding of all this relationship helps to you understand parts and main feature of the bone, such as first, maxilla has one bone, consists of the, I will choose one. Maxilla has single bone, consists of the parts. It is body and main processes. Okay, let's see. First, this main is body and processes. Directed upward is frontal processus frontalis maxilla. Directed laterally, processus zygomatic, from medial body, part of the body, yes, to the from lateral body of the maxilla to the zygomatic bone, fused with it. Yes, alveolar process. Yes, processus alveolaris maxilla, and on internal surface you can see the palatine process. They are all main processes of maxilla. Also, maxilla has main surfaces. This one, yes, call it anterior surface, posterior or variant like infratemporal surface, nasal surface, and palatine process or oral surface. The palatine surface, concave, are found along the inferior aspect of the palatine process of the maxilla. Is one of 5 surfaces of the maxilla. Belongs to the anterior infratemporal surface. Okay, let's count again. First, palatine, nasal, anterior, orbital, and infratemporal. Yes? And borders. First, this rim is nasal notch of the maxilla, also nasal border, which together with the nasal margin of the maxilla form the incisura piriformis, piriform notch of the maxilla, together with the opposite side. Also, we have lacrimal border, lacrimal notch, ethmoidal border and ethmoidal notch, margo ethmoidalis. Yes, and here we have margo zygomaticus, zygomatic margin, which is wide and form the suture later with zygomatic bone. This one is orbital margin of maxilla. Orbital margin of maxilla is the rim of the orbital fossa. That is the main borders and surfaces. The landmarks which we can find on it. First of all, we can see the on anterior surface. Sorry, some bad with this. On anterior surface of the maxilla. On the anterior surface of the maxilla, we can see the main prominent fossa of this bone, which describe it in anthropology like most unique part of this bone. It is canine fossa. Yes, most prominent is canine fossa, fossa canina. The large, deep depression found along the anterior surface of the maxilla. It is located inferior of the intraorbital foramen. Yes, here is the infraorbital foramen, which leads to the intraorbital canal. Yes, and provide origin of the side of levator anguli oris muscle. Yes, can be more deep or less deep. Okay, just below weight on the arc of the alveolar process, you can see most prominent part of this side. It is canine eminence. This is the prominence found along the anterior surface of the maxilla. Yes, it is prominent socket of canine tooth. Would be visible or optionally not. On the inferior surface of this bone, you can see the structure which called superior juga alveolaris, dental alveolar, which contains dental alveolar and septums of alveoli. alveoli are compared with dental alveolus, also with the tooth. You can see that such as molar teeth and premolar teeth has different shape of the alveolus by amount of the roots of the bone. Next one, on the palatine surface, you can see the two grooves. It is palatine grooves of the maxilla, which arise from the palatine sulcus. On the posterior surface of the maxilla, you can see the tuberculum of the maxilla and small foramens, which call it Foramen Maxillaris or Foramen Alveolaris, the passing of nerves which supply the teeth. On orbital surface, just above the orbital rim, you can see the infraorbital margin and anterior lacrimal crest, which form the inferior border of orbit. On the orbital surface of the maxilla, you can see the infraorbital groove, which communicate partially pterygopalatine fossa with canine fossa through the infraorbital canal. On the nasal surface of the maxilla, you can see the few of prominent parts, such as groove or notch of lacrimal sac. Yes, it is a lacrimal groove of maxilla, which join together with ethmoidal and lacrimal bones and conchas to form the canal, nasolacrimal canal later. Anteriorly of it, you have first rim, first crest, which call it crista conchalis maxilla. Crista conchalis maxilla. It's oblique anteriorly located ridge found along of the nasal surface of the maxilla. It then extends posterior superiorly from the nasal notch to the lacrimal groove, from nasal notch to the lacrimal groove of the maxilla, and articulate with the inferior nasal concha. Here will be found inferior nasal concha. There is superiorly of it, which located mostly on the process, is the ethmoidal crest. It was conchal. This is ethmoidal. Yes, ethmoidal crest is oblique and superiorly located ridge found along the nasal surface of the maxilla of the frontal process of the maxilla. Extend from the nasal notch, yes, toward the lacrimal margin of maxilla, yes, at the place of attachment of some aspect of ethmoidal bone, yes, and most prominent part of it, it is huge cavity inside, which call it maxillary sinus, and opening of the maxillary sinus, which call it same. Yes, which call it same as hiatus sinus maxillaris, which means the hiatus, means opening or some canal, probably looks like maxillary hiatus sinus maxillaris, or ostium, means opening of, yes, which is why, and laterly closed by conchas of the nasal cavity, will be formed as semilunar hiatus. Yes, and last structure which you can find on it, it is Palatine Crest. Yes, sorry, some problems with model. Palatine Crest and incisura's notch. Yes, here we can find this horizontal crest on the palate, nasal crest of the maxilla, and on opposite side, palatine crest, which can be prominent or not. It is nasal crest, which fuse together with spine, anterior nasal spine and posterior nasal spine, and between of them you can see the canal. It is half of the canal. From opposite side will be parallel or paired. Right maxilla to form canal, which call it incisive canal. Yes, will be looks like this. Yes, you see on it here. This one is incisive canal. Okay, that was the maxilla. Yes, we will join together with opposite side maxilla, and you will see the relationship of the maxillas with the nasal conchas, yes, to form nasal cavity later. Yes, together relationship the nasal crest with the vomer, posterior surface with the palatine bone, there is palatine bone. Yes. Also relationship the maxilla with the zygomatic bone, relationship with nasal bone and lacrimal bone. Okay, next bone which you have to learn also is mandible. Yes, there is mandible, or simple word in English is call it lower jaw, or mostly in scientific circle call it as mandible. Latin name is mandibula. Has several parts such as body of the mandible, corpus mandibulae, and ramus mandibulae, 2 parts. Yes, ramus is paired. Yes, there is ramus, and body of mandible is U-shaped, centrally located of the bone, horizontal, yes, and continuous superiorly onto the alveolar arch, yes, processus alveolaris. Also, the mandible has several processes. Ramus of mandible has one process, which call it condylar process, which has head and neck, and also has coronoid, condylar and coronoid, condylar and coronoid process. There is main parts of the mandible. Surfaces. It has only few of surfaces. Anterior or external surface of the body, external surface of the mandible ramus, or call it sometimes like lateral, facies lateral. Internal surface of the ramus and internal surface of the mandible. Inferior border of the mandible, call it base of the mandible, basis mandibularis. Anterior aspect of the ramus of the mandible, call it as anterior border of the ramus of mandible. Also call it like tempo or mandibulo molar groove. Also, posterior of the ramus has same name, posterior border of the ramus of mandibula. On the border between the ramus and body has present the angle of mandible. Yes, mandibular angle or Golian angle. 2 corners found along the posterior inferior aspect of the both right and left ramus of mandible. On its corresponding side, each angle of mandible located at the point of the posterior and inferior borders of the ramus mandible meet. Consists of the going, provides the incision side masseter, and some other masticatory muscle providers of attachment of stylomandibular ligament. Yes, on both sides, internal and external. Also on the process, superior aspect of the condyloid process, and prominent part of it, wide and prominent, called as the head of the mandible. The two extended articular superior ends of the condylar process, yes, and below of it, this side call it as neck of the mandible, column mandibula. Yes, two constricted inferior ends of the condylar process which contribute and continues to the ramus. Various main surfaces of the bone and landmarks which you can find on it. On anterior surface and base of the mandible could be found as the oblique lines, these two oblique lines of the mandible for both corresponding sides. This also is the site of origin of the some muscles. Between both halves of the mandible, after growing two halves of the bones in one, fusing in one, we have the mandible symphysis, yes, some suture which become an invisible in adult. Just below it is the spine, mantle protuberance. The mantle is triangular midline elevation found along the external surface of the body of mandible. Yes, and also is the site of origin of some muscles, and by size of it you can find, not in all people but some people has it, some person has this mantle tubercle, for example Negroid, or Africans or some Native Americans has no this tubercle. Yes, this tubercle which can you palpate through the skin on your chin is a mantle tubercle. Two small prominences along the external surface of the body of mandible. On the basal surface of the mandible, you can find the two digastric fossas. Yes, there is digastric fossas. Yes, site of attachment and origin of digastric muscle. Okay, next, external surface of the mandible is done. Okay, superior border. On superior border, same as on the superior jaw or the maxilla, you can see juga alveolaris, arch of teeth, arch of alveolus with the alveolar sockets and alveolar septums between. Also corresponding of the alveolar sockets with the number or amount of the roots of the teeth. Behind of them, you can find the two triangle structures. First, retromolar fossa, and one line which located above this triangle, which call it as temporal crest of the mandible, site of origin and site of attachment of the temporal masticatory muscle. On the superior border of the ramus of the mandible, you can find the mandibular notch, incisura mandibularis, site between the two processes, anterior coronoid and posterior condyloid process. And most complex in structures site, it is internal surface of the mandible, which have from top to down as canal, as foramen mandibularis and canalis mandibularis, which leads to the some specific canal inside of the bone, which covered by the lingula of the mandible. This is the two small projected found along of the medial aspect of this each ramus of mandible and corresponding side each lingula mandible. Yes, cover partially the foramen mandibularis here. Next structure is called as this oblique line from top to down from the Foramen Mandibularis. It's from the Foramen Mandibularis and Lingula directed downward is the Myohyoid Groove or Sulcus Myohyoideus. Two oblique depressions found along the medial surface of the ramus of the mandible and corresponding site of origin or insertion of the mylohyoid muscle, which contains into the wide fossa, which call it submandibular fossa, site of place like some shallow depression found along the internal surface of the body of mandible is like a line or lodges or some place of submandibular gland, salivary gland. Above it, this oblique line, call it as Myohyoid line. Yes, that was Myohyoid groove, sulcus, and Myohyoid line. Myohyoid groove and Myohyoid line, same side. And above of this side, more anteriorly, also located sublingual fossa. Sometimes can be not found on the real bone, but also present on some atlases. This too shallow depression, not so deep like the submandibular fossa, but still can be visible. This is loggia for the sublingual gland. Okay, on the midline, same suture in childhood and symphysis in newborn and adult. It is fusion in one complete bone, but on the inferior aspect of this symphysis or this fusion, two halves in one, you can see the superior and inferior mental spines, which can be found as one spine, paired or unpaired. All these features are individual. Yes, there's a site of origin of muscles, ligaments, and some fascias which form the diaphragm of the mouth. Okay. That was the two bones of the facial cranium, maxilla and mandible.